The funeral was standing room only. 300 people in St. Catherine's Cathedral, filling every pew and lining the walls and pressing into the narthex, where the late afternoon light fell through stained glass and cast colored shadows across faces that were uniformly arranged in the expression of public grief, solemn, respectful, controlled. They were here for Kael Moran, who had died at 36 of ovarian cancer, who had been a school teacher and a wife and a woman whose laughter could be heard 3 rooms away, and they were here because her husband was Kael Moran, who controlled the Port District, and attending the funeral of Kael Moran's wife was not optional for the 300 people whose lives intersected with his operations, but the grief was real. Kael had been loved, genuinely, widely, by people who had nothing to gain from loving her. She had been the kind of woman who remembered names and asked about children and brought food to neighbors who were sick, and who treated her husband's associates with the same warmth she treated her students, refusing to draw the line between the legitimate world and Kael's world that most people in her position would have drawn. She had been the light in every room she entered, and her death at 36 had extinguished something in the collective life of the Port District that everyone could feel and no one could name. Kael sat in the front pew. He was large and still, his broad shoulders filling the dark suit that he wore like armor, while his thick auburn hair pushed back from a face that was set in an expression of such controlled devastation that the people who knew him best, his lieutenants, his uncle's old associates, the men who had watched Kael grow from a dock worker's nephew into the most powerful man on the waterfront, looked at him and looked away, because the rawness beneath the control was too private to witness. He had not spoken since the hospital, not the silence of a man choosing not to speak, but the silence of a man whose voice had been taken by grief, the way cancer had taken Kael's voice. Gradually, completely, leaving him in a muteness that was temporary, but that felt, in these first days, as permanent as death itself. The priest spoke, friends spoke. Kael's sister read a poem that Kael had loved. The words washed over Kael like water over stone, present, touching the surface, leaving no impression. He was not listening. He was remembering. He was remembering Kael's last days at St. Catherine's Hospital. The cancer had spread to her throat, and the tumor had compressed her vocal cords, and in the final 2 weeks of her life, the woman whose laughter could fill a house had been unable to produce a single sound. She had communicated through her eyes and her hands, squeezing Kael's fingers in patterns they had developed together, blinking in sequences that the nurses had learned to read, moving her lips in words she could no longer voice. And then the interpreter had come. Inara Ose had been working at St. Catherine's Hospital for 4 years. As she had come to end-of-life interpretation through a path that was both unlikely and inevitable. Unlikely because a mute woman choosing to work in communication seemed paradoxical. Inevitable because the work required exactly what her muteness had given her: an extraordinary sensitivity to nonverbal expression, a deep comfort with silence, and the ability to be present with dying people without filling the room with unnecessary sound. She had been born mute. Her vocal cords had never functioned, a congenital condition that the doctors had explained to her parents with the clinical precision of people describing a mechanical fault, as if Inara were a machine with a missing component rather than a child with a different way of being in the world. Her parents, Kwame and Adele Ose, and Ghanaian African 9 immigrants who had come to the city when Adele was pregnant with Inara, had responded to the diagnosis not with grief, but with adaptation. They had learned sign language as a family, all 3 of them, signing at the dinner table and in the car and at the grocery store and in the park, making sign their household's first language and spoken English their second. Inara had grown up bilingual in the deepest sense, fluent in a language of the hands and fluent in the understanding of a language of the voice that she could perceive but never produce. Her father, Kwame, had been a carpenter. He had built things with his hands, furniture, cabinets, shelving, with the quiet pride of a man who understood that the work of the hands is the most honest work there is, because hands cannot lie. Or he had taught Inara that her hands were not a substitute for a voice, but a voice of their own, a different instrument playing the same music, a different road reaching the same destination. He had died 3 years ago, a stroke that took him in his workshop with sawdust on his clothes and a half-finished bookshelf on the bench, and Inara had been at his bedside in this same hospital and had held his hand as he died and had felt the particular devastation of losing the person who had first taught her that silence was not absence, but a different kind of presence. After Kwame's death, Inara had changed. She became more precise, more purposeful, more committed to the work of carrying dying people's last words. She understood now, from the inside, what the families of her patients experienced, as she understood the weight of last words, the way they lodged in your chest and stayed there, growing heavier with time rather than lighter, because the person who spoke them was no longer available to explain or revise or add to them, and the words became final in a way that living words never are. She had a routine. She woke at 5:30 in her small apartment near the hospital, an apartment filled with books and plants and the ordered quiet of a space designed by someone who navigates the world through touch and spatial memory. She watered her plants first, moving among the ferns and the spider plants and the small lemon tree that grew in a pot by the window, touching each one with the attentive care of someone who understands that living things need contact, and that the difference between a plant that thrives and a plant that merely survives is often as simple as being touched by someone who notices it. She walked to the hospital each morning, 15 minutes through the Riverside district, past the community garden where neighborhood children grew tomatoes in the summer, past the library where she volunteered on Saturday mornings teaching sign language to anyone who wanted to learn, past the bakery on the corner of Elm and River where the owner, a woman named Marguerite, who had learned to sign because Inara came in every morning, handed her a coffee and a croissant, and signed "Beautiful Day," regardless of the weather, because Marguerite believed that all days containing coffee were beautiful. At the hospital, Inara worked with patients who had lost the ability to speak, cancer patients whose tumors had taken their voices, stroke patients whose language centers had been damaged, ALS patients whose motor neurons had failed one by one until only their eyes could move. She sat with them. She held their hands. She watched their faces with the extraordinary attention of someone who had spent 26 years reading the world through every sense except speech, reading micro-expressions, reading hand pressure, reading the rate and rhythm of blinks, reading the muscle movements of lips forming words that the voice could no longer produce. She translated what she read into sign language, and she wrote down the words on her notepad for those who could not sign. She carried every patient's last words with her, not as a burden. She had learned to manage the weight through careful boundaries and daily prayer in the hospital chapel, but as a responsibility. She was the vessel through which the dying spoke their final truths, and she treated that responsibility with the reverence it deserved. She remembered every patient. She remembered every message. She prayed for each of them in the chapel at 12:30, her hands shaping prayers in the colored light, speaking to God in the language her parents had given her. She had appeared at Kael Moran's bedside on a Tuesday afternoon, a tall woman with dark skin and close-cropped hair and hands that moved with the fluidity of someone conducting music that no one else could hear. She was a sign language interpreter, the hospital had explained, specializing in end-of-life communication. She worked with patients who could no longer speak, translating their remaining methods of communication, hand squeezes, eye movements, lip movements, facial expressions, into sign language, and then into written words for the families. She was mute. This fact had struck Kael with a force he could not explain. A woman who could not speak, whose life's work was giving voice to others who could not speak. A woman who lived in the same silence that Aisling had been forced into, but who had been born there, who had built a life in that silence, who navigated it not as a prison, but as a native country. She had sat beside Aisling's bed. She had taken Aisling's hand, the hand that Kael was not holding, and the left hand with its IV and its bruises from failed insertions. And she had held it with a gentleness that was professional and personal simultaneously, the touch of someone who understood that a dying person's hand is not simply a hand but a lifeline, the last connection between the person leaving and the world they are leaving behind. She had watched Aisling's face. She had read the micro-movements of Aisling's lips, the patterns of her blinks, the pressure variations of her hand squeezes. And she had translated. Her hands had moved in the air above Aisling's bed, shaping words that Aisling could no longer say, giving form to the thoughts that were trapped inside a body that was shutting down system by system, organ by organ, voice first. Kael had watched those hands, where he had watched them shape his wife's thoughts into visible language, watched them move with the grace and precision of a dancer performing choreography that existed only in the moment, created in real time from the raw material of a dying woman's final communications. He did not know sign language. He could not read what the interpreter's hands were saying, but he could feel the meaning in the movement, the urgency, the tenderness, the weight of words that matter more than any words that have ever been spoken, because they are the last words, the final draft, the version of a life's message that cannot be revised or amended or taken back. The 12 days that Inara spent at Aisling's bedside were unlike anything in her 4 years of work at St. Catherine's. Most patients in her care were elderly, their communications fading gradually, and their final words often fragmentary. Single words, names, requests that were simple and heartbreaking in their simplicity. Water, home, mama. Aisling was different. Aisling was 36 and sharp and furious at her own dying, and determined to use every remaining channel of communication to say everything she needed to say before the channels closed for good. She communicated in layers. The hand squeezes were her primary language. She had developed a system with Kael that used pressure patterns to indicate letters, and Inara had learned the system within the first 2 days. Her extraordinary sensitivity to tactile communication, allowing her to read Aisling's squeezes with the same fluency she brought to reading facial expressions and lip movements. The blinks were her secondary language, a simpler system, yes for 1 blink. Esh, no for 2, more complex messages spelled out through a code the nurses had taped to the wall above the bed. And her lips. Her lips continued to form words, even when no sound came out, and Inara read them with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent her entire life watching mouths move and understanding what they said without hearing a syllable. Aisling spoke about her students. She spoke about the 7-year-olds in her class who were learning to read and who would need a substitute and who should be told. She spelled this out through hand squeezes with fierce insistence, that Mrs. Moran had gone on an adventure and that she was very proud of them, and that they should keep reading because reading is how you travel without leaving your chair. She spoke about her sister Claire, no leaving instructions about Christmas presents that she had already bought and hidden in the hall closet. She spoke about the garden, always the garden, returning to it again and again, the way a compass returns to north, as if the garden were her true coordinate, the fixed point around which all other concerns revolved. And she spoke about Kael, not to Kael, not directly, not in the conversations that passed between them through hand squeezes and eye contact, and the silent language of a marriage that had developed its own private vocabulary over 12 years. She spoke about Kael to Inara, using the interpreter as a confidant, as a confessor, tiger appoichon each sure as the keeper of secrets that she could not tell her husband to his face, because they would break him, and he was already breaking, and she needed him to hold together until she was gone so that she could leave without worrying about whether he would survive. She told Inara that Kael would not eat after she died. She told Inara that he would stop sleeping and start sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m. with whiskey he would not drink, because he did not actually like whiskey, but kept it because it seemed like the kind of thing a grieving man should have. She told Inara that he would close himself off, lock the doors, pull up the drawbridge, retreat into the fortress of his professional life, where emotion was a liability and grief was a weakness, and that he would stay locked in that fortress until someone found the key. "You're the key," Aisling had squeezed out on the 10th day, while Kael was in the corridor speaking with the oncologist. Her hand had gripped Inara's with a strength that seemed impossible for a woman whose body was shutting down system by system. "He'll come find you. He won't be able to help it. He never could leave anything unfinished. When he comes, and he will come, give him the message, not the one on paper, the other one, the one I'm going to tell you now. Promise me." Inara had promised. She had sat beside a dying woman's bed and made a promise that she did not fully understand, but that she recognized as sacred. The kind of promise that the dying extract from the living, because they know that the living will keep it. Because a promise made to someone who is leaving the world carries a weight that no promise made between the living can match. Aisling had told her the message, the secret message, the one that was not written down, the one that existed only in Inara's hands and in the space between a dying woman's intentions and a mute woman's promise. And Inara had carried it for 4 months, waiting, knowing. With the certainty that comes from reading a dying woman's face and understanding the absolute conviction behind her words, that he would come. The official message, the one on paper, the interpreter had written down. On a small notepad in neat handwriting that was careful and unhurried despite the circumstances, she had transcribed Aisling's final message to Kael. She had folded the paper and placed it in his hand and looked at him with dark brown eyes that held a depth of understanding that he had never encountered in a stranger. The understanding of someone who had spent her career carrying the last words of the dying and who knew exactly what that paper contained and exactly what it would cost him to read it. He had not read it at the hospital. He had not read it at home. He had read it at 3 a.m, sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the refrigerator and a glass of whiskey he had not touched beside him. And he had unfolded the paper and read Aisling's last words in the interpreter's neat handwriting, and the grief had broken through every wall he had built, and he had pressed the paper against his chest and wept with the full-body violence of a man who has been holding a dam in place with his bare hands and has finally, gratefully, let it break. If you can already feel what those words meant and what this man has lost, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that notification bell, because the moment Kael finds the woman who carried his wife's last words, this story takes a turn you will never forget. The words on the paper were simple. Aisling had never been a woman of complicated speech. She said what she meant with the directness of someone who grew up in a house where clarity was valued more than cleverness. Her last words, translated through the hands of a mute interpreter and written on hospital notepaper, were, "Don't keep me in a box, Kael. Keep me in the garden. I want to be where things grow, and find someone whose hands are gentle. Yours are too rough to be alone." He carried the paper in his wallet. He had carried it for 4 months. He had read it so many times that the folds were wearing through and the ink was fading at the creases, and he would need to copy it soon or lose it, and the thought of copying it, of transferring Aisling's last words from the paper the interpreter had written them on to a fresh sheet, felt like a betrayal, because the original paper had been touched by the interpreter's hands, the hands that had carried Aisling's voice, and the paper was not just a message, but a relic. In a physical connection to the moment when his wife's thoughts had passed through a stranger's hands and become words he could hold. He had tried to find the interpreter. He had asked at the hospital, and they had told him her name, Inara Osei, and that she worked in the end-of-life care unit, and that she was mute, and that she was one of the most requested interpreters in the hospital because of her extraordinary ability to read dying patients' communications with an accuracy and a sensitivity that bordered on the telepathic. They had given him her work schedule. He had not used it. He had stood in the hospital parking lot with the schedule in his hand and felt the weight of what he wanted. Not from her, not anything she could give, but something he could not name, a connection to the last moment of Isling's voice, and a bridge between the silence that had taken his wife and the silence that this woman inhabited. And he had put the schedule in his pocket and driven home and done nothing. 4 months. 4 months of carrying the paper and the schedule and the memory of hands moving in the air above his wife's bed. 4 months of the particular paralysis that afflicts men who are accustomed to decisive action and who find themselves undone by something that does not respond to decisiveness. Grief, longing, the inarticulate need to be in the presence of someone who understood what was lost, because they were there when it was lost. In those 4 months, Kael had become a man his associates barely recognized. He still ran the port district. The operations continued, the logistics moved, the money flowed through the channels he had built, but he ran it from a distance. Through Brennan and through the lieutenants who had learned to interpret his silences and his brief, flat directives as instructions rather than conversation. He attended meetings and said what was necessary and left. He made decisions that were competent but joyless, the calculations of a mind that was functioning at full capacity in one hemisphere while the other hemisphere burned. The house was the worst of it. The house where Aisling had hung curtains and planted the garden and filled every room with the evidence of a life being lived. Her books on the bedside table, her reading glasses on the kitchen counter, her coat hanging by the door as if she had just stepped out and would return any moment with groceries and a story about the man at the cheese counter who had opinions about Brie. He had not moved her things. He had not cleaned out her closet. He had not washed the coffee mug she had used last, the blue one with the chipped handle that she had refused to throw away, because, she said, imperfect things deserved loyalty. He sat in the garden some evenings, the garden she had asked to be kept in, the garden where she wanted to remain. He had not scattered her ashes yet. They sat in an urn on the mantelpiece, waiting for the moment when he could bring himself to open his hands and let her go, and that moment had not come, and he was beginning to suspect that it would never come unless something changed, and unless someone or something broke through the amber of grief that had encased him and gave him permission to move forward. Permission. That was the word that Aisling had used in her last message. Not explicitly. She had said, "I'm opening my hands, I'm letting go so he can hold something else." But the meaning was permission. Permission to grieve and then to stop grieving. Permission to love again. Permission to live in the tense that matters most, which is not the past tense of what was lost, but the present tense of what remains. He carried the paper. He carried the schedule. He carried the memory of hands signing in the air above a hospital bed, and he waited for the courage to act on what he carried, and then the funeral, and then the cathedral. And then 300 people, and a priest and a poem, and the coffin at the altar, and the flowers, and the incense, and the terrible, formal ceremony of public goodbye. Kael was not listening to the speakers. He was staring at the back of the cathedral, at the place where the pews ended and the standing crowd began, and he was thinking about nothing and everything, and then he saw her. She was standing near the back wall, to the left of the baptismal font. She wore a dark blouse and dark trousers, and she was taller than most of the women around her, and her close-cropped hair and dark skin and angular face were unmistakable. She was the interpreter. Inara Osei, She had come to the funeral. She was not there in a professional capacity. She was there because she had held Isling's hand in the final days and had carried Isling's last words from silence into language, and she had come to say goodbye to a woman she had known for only 12 days, but whose final thoughts she had translated with her hands and would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. She was signing. Standing at the back of the cathedral, her hands moving in small private gestures at her sides, not performing for anyone, not interpreting for a deaf attendee, but signing to herself, the way hearing people murmur her prayers under their breath. She was praying in sign language, and the prayer was for Aisling, and her hands shaped the words with the same grace and precision that Kael remembered from the hospital room. Valpert, and the sight of her hands moving in the colored light of the stained glass windows broke something in him that the funeral itself had not broken. He watched her through the rest of the service. He watched her hands sign the prayers and the hymns and the final blessing, translating the spoken ceremony into the visual language of her body, and the movement of her hands was the most beautiful and the most painful thing he had seen since Isling's death, because those hands were the last instrument that had carried his wife's voice, and seeing them move was like hearing an echo of something that no longer existed. After the funeral, she was gone. He looked for her in the crowd outside the cathedral, or among the mourners who gathered on the steps and in the parking lot and along the iron fence that separated the church grounds from the street. She was not there. She had come, and she had prayed, and she had left, disappearing into the city the way silence disappears into noise. Completely, instantly, leaving no trace except the memory of its presence. He sent Brennan to find her. Brennan was his most trusted man, a quiet carryman in his 50s, with silver temples and steady hands, and the particular talent for finding people that comes from 30 years of paying attention to the way the world works, to the patterns of movement and habit and routine that constitute a life. He had served Kael's uncle before Kael, and he had watched the boy become a man, and the man become a leader, and the leader become a husband, and he had watched the husband break when the wife died, and he was the only person in Kael's organization who would have dared to say what he said when Kael gave him the assignment. "You want me to find the interpreter?" "Yes." "The one from the hospital, the one who translated Isling's words?" "Yes." "Because you need to see her again." "Because I need to see her hands again. I need to be near the last place Isling's voice existed." "I don't know what to do with that need, Brennan. I don't know what it means. But it's the only thing I felt in 4 months that isn't grief, and I'm not going to ignore it." Brennan looked at him, the way he had looked at Kael's uncle when the old man made decisions that were driven by something deeper than strategy, and nodded and said nothing more. Because Brennan understood that some assignments are not about information gathering, but about permission, about a man asking his most trusted person to help him take the first step towards something he cannot name. But Inara was not hiding. She was simply living, going to work at St. Catherine's, going home to her apartment near the hospital, existing in the ordinary rhythms of a life that Kael's world had briefly intersected and that had continued without him. Brennan reported back within 2 days. Her name, her address, her work schedule, the route she walked between her apartment and the hospital. Kael listened to the information and told Brennan to stop. He did not want surveillance. He did not want the apparatus of his professional life applied to this woman. He wanted to find her, but he wanted to find her as Kael, and not as the man who controlled the Port District. He wanted to find her the way ordinary people find each other, by going to where she was and standing in front of her and being honest. He went to the hospital. He did not go to the end-of-life care unit. He went to the chapel, a small, quiet room on the ground floor with wooden pews and a stained glass window depicting St. Catherine and a perpetual candle burning in a red glass holder. He went because Isling had loved the chapel, had spent hours there during her treatment, had told Kael that it was the only place in the hospital that didn't smell like a hospital, and he went because it was a neutral space, a space that belonged to neither his world nor Inara's, a space where two people could meet without the weight of their respective contexts pressing down on them. Our brother Tomas was in the chapel. He was a lay brother who had served St. Catherine's for 40 years, a thin, stooped man with silver hair and the careful movements of someone who has spent decades in the company of the dying and has learned to move through the world as gently as possible. He recognized Kael. "You're Aisling's husband?" "I am." She loved this chapel. She sat in the third pew from the front, and she told me that the light through the window in the afternoon made her feel like she was inside a painting. She was a remarkable woman. She was. "You're looking for Inara?" Kael looked at the old man. Brother Tomas returned the look with the serene certainty of someone who has seen every variation of human need and recognizes them all. "She comes here on her lunch break, 12:30. To apply, she sits in the back pew and she signs. I don't know sign language, but I've watched her hands enough to know she's praying. She prays for her patients, every one of them. She carries their words, and then she comes here and she prays for their souls. She's been doing this for 4 years. Does she know I've been looking for her? She knows. The hospital is small. People talk. She knows you asked about her. Why hasn't she? Because she's careful. Because the families of patients sometimes attach to her. She carries their loved ones' last words, and that creates a bond that can be overwhelming. She maintains boundaries, professional distance. She has to, or the weight of what she carries would crush her." Brother Tomas paused. He looked at Kael with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had spent 4 decades in the space between the living and the dead, and who understood, with the depth that only proximity to death can teach, that the living need permission almost as much as the dying need peace. "But I will tell you something, Kael. I have watched Inara pray in this chapel for 4 years. She prays for every patient, every single one. She signs their names, and she signs their messages, and she holds them in her hands, the way a priest holds the sacrament. And in 4 years, I have never seen her cry in the chapel. Not once. She cries elsewhere, I'm sure. She is human, and the work she does would break a person who did not allow themselves to grieve. But in the chapel, she is composed, professional, contained." He looked at the stained glass window, at the colored light falling across the empty pews. "Except once. The day after your wife died, Inara came to the chapel at 12:30, and she sat in the back pew, and she signed Aisling's name, and then she wept. She wept for 20 minutes. Silent tears. The only kind she has. But the grief was not silent. The grief filled this room. I sat 3 pews away and I felt it. She was not weeping as an interpreter who had lost a patient. She was weeping as a woman who had lost a friend. 12 days, Kael. Your wife made a friend in 12 days without speaking a word. That tells you something about both of them." Kael sat in the chapel pew and absorbed this information. The image of Inara weeping in the colored light, signing Aisling's name into the empty air. Grieving a woman she had known for less than 2 weeks, but whose last words she had carried in her hands, and whose humor and warmth and fierce refusal to die quietly had reached through the professional barriers that Inara maintained and touched her in a place that was not professional at all. "I'll wait for her," Kael said. "Here, at 12:30. Brother Tomas nodded. He placed a hand on Kael's shoulder. The brief, weighted touch of a man who has blessed thousands of people and who understands that sometimes a hand on a shoulder communicates more than any prayer. And he left the chapel, closing the door behind him with the careful quietness that was his signature, the quietness of someone who has spent a lifetime ensuring that the spaces he moves through remain undisturbed. We are at the center of this story now, where grief meets grace and silence meets understanding. If you feel the pull between these two people, the man searching for the echo of his wife's voice and the woman who carries that echo in her hands, Subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment, because what happens next will stay with you. Kael came to the chapel at 12:30. He sat in the front pew with his back to the door and waited. At 12:32, he heard the door open and close with the careful quietness of someone who enters sacred spaces the way they should be entered, gently, with awareness that the silence inside is a living thing that deserves respect. He did not turn around. He sat and listened to the silence behind him, the particular silence of a person who makes no sound, because sound was never part of their vocabulary. He could feel her presence the way you feel warmth from a fire in the next room, indirect, unmistakable, changing the temperature of the space. A minute passed, 2. Then a soft tap on the wooden pew beside him. He turned. She was standing in the aisle, one hand on the pew back, looking at him with those extraordinary dark eyes that he remembered from the hospital room. She was taller than he remembered, or perhaps he had been sitting the last time he saw her, and the perspective had changed. Her face was as expressive as he remembered, mobile, alive, communicating through micro-movements that most people produce unconsciously, but that she had refined into a language as complex and as nuanced as any spoken tongue. Yeah, she held up her notebook. On the page, in the same neat handwriting that had transcribed Aisling's last words, she had written, "I came to the funeral. I hope that was okay." "It was," he said. "It was more than okay. She would have wanted you there." Inara wrote, "I carry all my patients with me, but Aisling was different. She was funny, even at the end. She made faces at the nurses when they weren't looking. She spelled out jokes with her hand squeezes." Kael felt his chest tighten. What kind of jokes? Inara's face broke into a smile, wide, warm, transforming her angular features into something radiant, and she wrote, "She squeezed out, 'Tell my husband his hair looks like a wet dog on her second to last day.' I didn't translate that one." Kael laughed. The sound surprised him. It was the first time he had laughed in 4 months, and the sound was rusty and raw and strange in the quiet chapel, and it was the sound of Aisling's humor reaching him from beyond death through the hands of a woman who had never spoken a word in her life. "That sounds like her," he said. "That sounds exactly like her." They sat in the chapel pew, he in the front, she in the row behind him, because the pews were narrow and facing each other would have required a physical closeness that neither was ready for. She wrote in her notebook, and he read over his shoulder, and they talked, if talking is what you call the exchange between a grieving man's voice and a mute woman's handwriting, about Aisling. He told her about Aisling's laugh. He told her about Aisling's classroom, where she taught 7-year-olds with a combination of warmth and absolute authority that made 30 children sit still and listen. He told her about Aisling's garden, the garden that the last words had mentioned, the garden behind their house where Aisling grew tomatoes and herbs and sunflowers and the roses that climbed the back wall, and that she talked to as if they were students who needed encouragement. Inara wrote about Aisling's hands, about how Aisling's hand squeezes had been surprisingly strong even in the final days, how the patterns she used were inventive and precise, how she had developed a squeeze language of remarkable complexity in just a few days. She was a natural communicator, Inara wrote. Even when every other system was failing, her need to communicate was the last thing to go. That tells you everything about who she was. Kael looked at the words on the page and felt the familiar wave of grief rise and crest and fall inside him. And for the first time in 4 months, the wave did not knock him flat. It rose, and it fell, and he remained standing, metaphorically, spiritually, because he was not alone in the wave. Someone else was there. Someone who had been present at the moment of his greatest loss, who had carried his wife's voice when his wife could no longer carry it herself, and whose presence in this chapel, with her notebook and her expressive eyes and her extraordinary hands, was not a solution to his grief, but a witness to it. a companion in the territory of loss that most people only visit, but that Inara inhabited daily. "The words you wrote down," he said. "Aisling's last words. I carry them in my wallet." Inara nodded. She already knew this. Not because anyone had told her, but because she understood, from years of carrying dying patients' last messages, that the words she transcribed became sacred objects for the families who received them, relics of a final communion that would be held and reread and wept over until the paper wore through. "She asked me to keep her in the garden," he said, "and she told me to find someone whose hands are gentle." He looked at Inara's hands. They were resting on the notebook, long-fingered, graceful, still. The hands that had shaped Aisling's last words in the air. The hands that spoke a language Aisling had never learned, but that had carried Aisling's voice with more fidelity and more tenderness than any spoken translation could have achieved. "And I think she meant you," he said. Inara's eyes widened. Her lips parted. Not to speak, because speech was not available to her, but in the involuntary expression of surprise that crosses every human face, regardless of whether that face belongs to someone who communicates with voice or with hands. She looked at him, and in her dark eyes he saw the careful professionalism of a woman who maintained boundaries, who kept distance, who understood that grief makes people say things they do not mean and attach to people they should not attach to. She wrote, "I was doing my job. I was there for Aisling, not for you. What you felt in that room was grief, Kael, not connection. Grief makes everything feel like connection because it opens you up and everything pours in." "I know what grief is," he said. "I've been living inside it for 4 months, and I know the difference between grief and recognition. Grief is what I felt when she died. Recognition is what I felt when I watched your hands move." Inara looked at him for a long time. The chapel was quiet around them. The kind of quiet that exists only in spaces dedicated to contemplation, a quiet that has texture and weight, and that holds the conversations that happen inside it, the way water holds the fish that swim through it. She wrote, "I don't know your world. I know what people say about you. I know the Port District. I know what your name means to certain people. And I'm a woman who works in a hospital and teaches sign language to nursing students on weekends and goes home to an apartment full of books and plants. Our worlds don't overlap. They overlapped in a hospital room. They overlapped over Aisling's bed. They're overlapping right now." Inara studied him, not with the casual assessment of a stranger evaluating another stranger, but with the deep, practiced attention she brought to her work, the reading of faces that had become her primary mode of understanding the world. She read his face the way she read her dying patients' faces, comprehensively, without judgment, with the understanding that what a face shows is often the opposite of what a person intends to communicate. She saw his grief. It was the dominant landscape of his features, written in the deep furrows between his brows, and the shadows under his eyes, and the tension along his jaw that spoke of nights spent clenching his teeth against the sounds that wanted to escape. She saw his anger, not directed at her, not directed at anyone in particular, but the free-floating fury that accompanies loss, the rage at the universe for taking something that should not have been taken. She saw his loneliness, the most carefully hidden layer, buried beneath the grief and the anger and the controlled composure that his public life demanded. The particular isolation of a man who is surrounded by people who fear him and who has lost the one person who did not. And she saw something else, something she had not seen in the hospital room or at the funeral or in any of the careful conversations with the nurses who whispered about the Mafia boss's wife. She saw honesty, raw, unstrategic, as defenseless honesty, the honesty of a man who has been stripped of every layer of protection by grief and who is sitting in a chapel pew without armor, without agenda, without anything except the truth of what he needs. She wrote in the notebook, "I need you to understand something. I carry the last words of the dying. That is my work and my calling, and I do it with everything I have. But I also have to protect myself from the grief that comes with it. Every family I work with, every husband, every wife, every child attaches to me because I am the last person who heard their loved one speak. I become a relic, a sacred object, and I cannot be a sacred object, Kael. I am a person. I am a 26-year-old woman who cannot speak and who goes home every night to an apartment where no one is waiting and who sometimes sits in the dark and wonders if the silence she was born into is a gift or a cage. I cannot carry your grief for you. I can only carry the words." Kael read the words. He read them twice. Then he said, "I'm not asking you to carry my grief. I'm asking you to sit in a chapel with me and let me be near the person who held my wife's hand when she died. That's all. That's everything. I will not ask you for more than you want to give. I will not bring my world into yours. I will come here at 12:30 every day, and I will sit in this pew, and if you want to sit in the next pew and write in your notebook and tell me things about Aisling that I didn't know, I will consider that the greatest kindness anyone has shown me since she died. And if you don't come, I'll understand. I'll sit here anyway. Because this is where she said the light made her feel like she was inside a painting." Inara looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote, 12:30. I have 45 minutes for lunch. Don't be late. I hate waiting. The smallest smile appeared at the corner of Kael's mouth. The first movement in that direction since Aisling's death, a tectonic shift so small that a seismograph would have missed it. But that Inara, who read faces the way other people read books, caught immediately and stored in the part of her memory where she kept important things. She closed the notebook. She placed her pen on top of it. She raised her hands, and for the first time since the hospital room, or she signed to him, not writing, not the indirect communication of pen on paper, but the direct language of her body, her hands shaping words in the air between them with the same grace and precision that had translated Aisling's final message. He could not understand the signs. He watched her hands move, and he could not read a single word, but he could feel the meaning in the movement, the same way he had felt it in the hospital room, the emotional content that transcended linguistic comprehension, the universal human capacity to understand what another person is communicating even when you do not share their language. "I don't understand sign language," he said. She picked up the notebook. She wrote, "I said, your wife told me to tell you something that I didn't write down. She made me promise to deliver it in person, not on paper. She said you'd come find me. She said you wouldn't be able to help it because you never could leave anything unfinished." Kael's chest stopped moving. His lungs forgot their function. The chapel contracted around him, and the stained glass light seemed to pulse, and the candle flame in its red glass holder flickered as if a breath had passed through the room. "What did she tell you?" Inara put down the notebook. She raised her hands again. She signed slowly, deliberately, making each gesture clear and readable, even to someone who had never learned a word of sign language. She pointed at Kael. She placed both hands over her heart. She moved her hands outward, opening them, releasing something into the air. She pointed upward. She smiled. He watched her hands. He could not translate the specific signs, but he could read the gesture, the pointing, the heart, the opening, the upward motion, the smile. And he understood with the sudden, devastating clarity that comes when something you have been searching for is finally found, that Aisling's last untranscribed message was simple and complex and exactly what Aisling would have said. "She said she's letting me go," he said. "She said it's okay." Inara nodded. Tears were sliding down her angular face, silent tears, the only kind she knew. She wrote on the notebook. She said, Tell him I'm opening my hands. Tell him I'm letting go so he can hold something else. Tell him to look up. Kael looked up. The stained glass window above the altar showed St. Catherine in blue and gold, a breathless, and the afternoon light was falling through it the way Aisling had described Brother Thomas, making the chapel feel like the inside of a painting. And the colored light fell on his face and on Inara's hands and on the space between them, where Aisling's last words hung in the air like a benediction. The chapel visits became their meeting place. Every day at 12:30, Kael came to the chapel and Inara came on her lunch break, and they sat in adjacent pews and talked, his voice and her notebook, and increasingly her hands, because he was learning. He was learning sign language. The first week was about Aisling. They built her between them, piece by piece, the way archaeologists reconstruct a vase from fragments, Kael providing the large pieces. The years of marriage, and the daily rituals and the arguments, and the reconciliations, and the slow Sunday mornings in bed, with coffee and the newspaper, and Inara providing the small pieces, the 12 days of final communication, the hand squeezes and eye movements, and lip-formed words that had constituted Aisling's last chapter. Inara told him things he did not know, that Aisling had squeezed out a message for her sister on the third day. Tell Claire to stop wearing beige. She looks washed out. Wear red. Red is for living. That Aisling had blinked a pattern on the fifth day that Inara had interpreted as, is he still here? He needs to eat. He gets stupid when he doesn't eat. That Aisling, on her second to last day, had formed a word with her lips that Inara had read clearly and transcribed in her own personal notebook, not the official record, but the private journal she kept of the words that mattered most. The word was garden. She told him about Aisling's last joke. The real last joke, not the wet dog comment, which was the second to last. On her final morning, when the morphine was softening everything and the monitors were telling the story that everyone already knew, Aisling had squeezed out a message for the head nurse. Tell Nurse Patrick his coffee is terrible. If I have to die, at least let me die with accurate reviews. Inara had translated it, and the nurse had laughed and then cried, and then brought Aisling a cup of the good coffee from the doctor's lounge. Ayn and Aisling had inhaled the steam. She could no longer drink, and blinked once, which meant yes, which meant thank you, which meant this is what matters in the final hours. Not grand gestures, but small kindnesses, good coffee, the laughter of people who care about you. She told him about Aisling's hands in those last hours, how they had grown weaker but never still, always reaching, always squeezing, always communicating, as if the connection between Aisling's mind and her hands was the last circuit to remain active, the deepest wiring, the pathway that refused to shut down, even as everything else went dark. Aisling had squeezed Inara's hand on the last afternoon, and the squeeze had been barely perceptible, the ghost of a touch, and the echo of the strength that had been there 2 weeks before, and Inara had leaned close and read Aisling's lips, and the word was garden, and then the word was gentle, and then the word was Kael's name, formed one final time by lips that would not move again. Inara wrote all of this in her notebook with the steady precision of someone who understood that these details were not merely stories, but medicine. The specific, targeted medicine that Kael needed to heal the wound of not having been present for every moment of his wife's final days. The wound of having left the room for coffee, or for phone calls, or for the brief intervals when the nurses changed shifts and the oncologists updated charts, and the machinery of institutional dying required the living to step aside. And Kael listened to these fragments and felt Aisling reassemble inside him. Not the Aisling of grief, the diminished, sanctified version that death creates, but the real Aisling, the one who insulted her sister's wardrobe and worried about his eating habits and thought about her garden even as her body was shutting down. The real Aisling, who was funnier and sharper and more alive than grief had allowed him to remember. The second week was about Inara. She told him through the notebook about growing up mute in a hearing world, about the isolation of school, where even the kindest teachers spoke too fast for her to lip read, and the other children regarded her silence as an invitation to either pity or cruelty, about the liberation of discovering the deaf community in college, where she had learned that there was an entire world of people who communicated with their hands, who understood that language does not require vocal cords, who moved through the world with the same silence she inhabited, and who regarded that silence not as a disability, but as a culture. She told him about her mother, Adele, who still lived in the family apartment in the Riverside district, and who signed with the fluid ease of a woman who had been speaking with her hands for 26 years and who sometimes forgot, in the grocery store or the bus, that not everyone could understand the conversation she was having with her fingers. She told him about teaching sign language to nursing students on weekends, about the satisfaction of watching hearing people discover that their hands could speak, and that the language of the body was as rich and as nuanced as the language of the voice. She did not tell him about the loneliness, not in the second week. That came later, in the third week, on a rainy Thursday when the chapel was darker than usual and the stained glass light was muted by the clouds, and Kael arrived with 2 cups of coffee. He had learned that she took hers black, no sugar, the same way Marguerite at the bakery made it. And Inara looked at the coffee, and then at him, and then at the notebook and wrote something she had not planned to write. The hardest part of being mute is not the silence. The silence is mine. I was born in it. The hardest part is the space between me and everyone else. The gap that exists because I cannot call out across a room, cannot shout to get someone's attention. I cannot laugh out loud or cry out or say, "I love you," in the dark when the lights are off and hands can't be seen. The gap is not silence. The gap is distance, and some days the distance feels like the entire width of the world. Kael read the words. He looked at her. This tall, angular, extraordinary woman who carried the last words of the dying and who went home every night to an apartment where the distance between her and the rest of the world could not be bridged by the sound of her own voice. And he said, "I know about distance. I've been standing on the other side of a gap for 4 months, the gap between having Aisling and not having her, the gap between the man I was when she was alive and whoever I am now. I can't call across it either. My voice works fine and it doesn't help. The gap doesn't care about volume. It cares about presence, and the only time the gap gets smaller is when I'm sitting in this pew next to you." Inara looked at him. She put down the pen. She raised her hand and placed it against the wooden pew between them, not reaching for him, not crossing the boundaries she had set, but placing her hand in the space between them. The way you place a bridge foundation, the first structural element of something that might eventually span the distance. Kael looked at her hand. He placed his own hand on the pew beside it, not touching. Not yet. But close enough that the warmth of each hand was perceptible to the other. Close enough that the gap between them had narrowed to the width of a breath. Close enough that both of them understood that the distance was no longer the entire width of the world. It was the width of a chapel pew. Yeah, and it was getting smaller. He had hired a tutor, a deaf woman named Helen, who taught ASL at the community college, and he studied every evening in the house that Aisling had filled with laughter, and that was now filling with a different sound. The silence of concentration, the quiet of a man learning a new language because the woman he wanted to talk to spoke with her hands. Helen came 3 times a week. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had been deaf from birth and who taught sign language with the exacting standards of someone who regarded her language as equal to any spoken tongue, and who would not accept sloppy signing from her students any more than a French teacher would accept garbled pronunciation. She did not know who Kael was, or if she knew, she did not care, because the deaf community occupies a different social geography than the hearing world, and the hierarchies of the Port District meant nothing in a space where the only currency was communication. She drilled him on the alphabet first. A BCD, his large fingers forming letters that looked like a bear attempting origami. She corrected his hand positions with sharp taps on his wrists, adjusting the angle of his fingers, the rotation of his palms, the height of his signs in the space before his body. She made him practice facial expressions, an essential component of sign language grammar that hearing people almost always underestimate, because in ASL, the eyebrows and the mouth and the tilt of the head modify meaning the way no tone modifies spoken language. Verbeitswassing, and a sign without the correct facial expression is like a sentence without punctuation. Technically readable, but fundamentally incomplete. He practiced after Helen left, sitting at the kitchen table with the textbook open and the house quiet around him, and Isling's blue mug still on the counter, and the urn on the mantelpiece, and the garden visible through the kitchen window in the evening light. He formed signs in the empty air. He signed hello and goodbye and thank you and beautiful and I understand and please wait and tell me more. He signed the words he would need in the chapel, the vocabulary of conversation, of emotion, of the kind of exchange that happens between two people who are building something from the raw materials of shared loss and growing trust. He did not practice, I love you, not yet. That sign, the hand extended with the thumb, index finger, and pinky raised, the universal sign that even hearing people recognize, sat in the textbook like a door he was not ready to open. He knew the shape. Helen had taught it as part of the emotional vocabulary unit, placing it alongside happy and sad and angry and afraid, with the matter-of-fact inclusiveness of a language teacher who knows that all emotions deserve equal grammatical attention. But Kael had not formed the sign with his hand. He had looked at the illustration in the textbook and felt Isling's last words stir in his wallet. Find someone whose hands are gentle. And he had turned the page and practiced weather instead, because weather was safe and love was not. Inara noticed his progress. Each day in the chapel, his hands were a little more fluent, a little more confident, the signs a little closer to the fluid grace that characterized native signers. He was still clumsy. He confused mother with father, because the handshapes were similar, and he consistently signed hungry when he meant happy, because the motions overlapped in his muscle memory. But his errors were the errors of effort, not indifference, and Inara corrected them with the patient attention of a woman who had been teaching people to sign for years and who recognized in Kael's clumsy hands the same determination she had seen in her nursing students, the willingness to look foolish in the service of understanding. She began teaching him informally during their chapel meetings. She would sign a word slowly, then take his hands and position them correctly. White in the contact, her long graceful fingers, adjusting his large blunt ones, shaping his hands into the configurations of her language, was the most intimate physical contact either of them had experienced since their respective losses. She was touching his hands to teach him to speak her language, and the act of teaching carried within it a tenderness that transcended pedagogy, because every word she taught him was a word he could use to talk to her without the mediation of a notebook. Every sign was a bridge across the distance she had described on that rainy Thursday. Every corrected finger position was an act of inclusion, of welcoming him into the world she inhabited, the world of the hands. On the third week, he signed his first question to her without the notebook. How was your day? The signs were approximate. His facial expression was wrong. He looked stern rather than inquisitive, because he had not yet mastered the eyebrow raise that turns a statement into a question in ASL. But the meaning was clear, and Inara read it, and her face did something that he had not seen before, a softening, a brightening, the expression of someone who has been handed a gift they did not expect, and that means more than the giver could possibly know. She signed back. better now. 2 words, 2 signs. The simplest possible response to the simplest possible question. But in those 2 signs, shaped by her graceful hands, in the colored light of the chapel, and Kael read everything that she had not yet written in her notebook, and that her professional boundaries had not yet allowed her to express. That his presence at 12:30 had become the axis around which her day turned. That the chapel had changed from a place of solitary prayer to a place of shared breath. That the distance she had described on that rainy Thursday, the distance that was the width of the world, had narrowed to the width of a chapel pew and was still narrowing. Day by day, sign by sign, notebook page by notebook page, he began bringing her things. Not gifts? Inara would not have accepted gifts. She had the same fierce pride about reciprocity that governed everything in her life. But small offerings that demonstrated attention. Coffee, always. A croissant from Marguerite's bakery, because he had learned from Brother Thomas Diaz that she stopped there every morning, and he wanted her to know that he had noticed the details of her routine. A book of poetry by a Ghanaian poet that he had found in the bookshop on River Street after spending 45 minutes in the poetry section. A man who had never read poetry voluntarily in his life, standing in a bookshop reading back covers and trying to find something that a mute woman who prayed in sign language might want to read. The bookshop owner had watched him with undisguised curiosity and had finally asked if he needed help, and Kael had said, "I need a book for someone who speaks with her hands." And the bookshop owner had looked at him for a long moment and then walked to the poetry section and pulled out a slim volume and said, "This one. Net, the poems are about language and silence and the space between them. If she speaks with her hands, she'll understand every word." Inara had held the book in her lap and run her fingers across the cover and opened it and read the first poem and looked up at Kael with an expression that contained multitudes. Surprise, recognition, the particular emotion that occurs when someone gives you something that demonstrates not just thoughtfulness, but understanding, not just attention, but comprehension of who you are. She had signed "Thank you," the sign she had taught him on their 3rd day, his palm touching his chin and moving outward, and he had signed it back, and the exchange of identical signs between them felt like the first time 2 people speaking different languages discover a word they share. It was slow. His large, blunt fingers were not built for the delicate articulations of sign language, and the grammar was nothing like English, and the spatial component, the way signs change meaning based on where in space they are placed, required a 3-dimensional thinking that his strategic mind could grasp conceptually, but that his hands struggled to execute. He signed like a man translating from a foreign language, stiffly, with pauses, missing the fluid connections between signs that made Inara's signing look like water flowing. But he was learning, and Inara watched him learn with an expression that began as professional interest and developed, over the weeks, into something warmer. The tenderness of watching someone struggle with something difficult because they want to communicate with you, like the specific emotional response that occurs when a person invests significant effort in learning your language, which is, when you think about it, one of the most intimate things one person can do for another. He signed his first complete sentence to her on a Thursday in the chapel, 3 weeks after their first meeting. His hands moved awkwardly, the signs approximate but recognizable. "Your hands are the most important thing I have ever seen." Inara looked at his hands, those large, scarred, blunt-fingered hands forming the shapes of her language with the clumsy earnestness of a beginner. And she smiled the smile that transformed her face, the wide, warm smile that reached her extraordinary eyes and made them shine with something that was not grief and not professionalism and not the careful distance she maintained with the families of her patients. She signed back slowly so he could follow. Your hands are learning. That is the most important thing anyone has ever done for me." He reached across the pew. He took her hand, her long, graceful, signing hand, in his large, rough, learning hand, and they sat in the chapel of St. Catherine's Hospital, and the silence between them was not the silence of absence, but the silence of fullness, the silence of two people who have run out of words because the moment is larger than language, because what they feel cannot be contained in signs or speech, or the neat handwriting of a notebook. Inara turned his hand over in hers. She traced the lines of his palm with her fingertip, the calluses, the scars, the blunt fingers that were learning to shape her language with the stubborn determination of a man who had decided that this woman was worth the effort of relearning how to communicate. She traced the gold wedding band that he still wore, running her finger around the circle of metal that represented a promise he had made to Aisling, and that he was only now beginning to understand did not end with death, but transformed, became a different kind of promise. The promise to live, to love again, to keep the garden growing. She placed his hand against her cheek, not signing, not writing, not communicating through any of the channels that her professional life had taught her to use, but through the simplest and oldest form of human connection, touch. His rough palm against her smooth cheek, his fingers curling gently against the warmth of her skin, and the contact said everything that his clumsy signs could not yet say, and that her notebook could not contain. "Aisling was right," he said quietly, "about the garden, about gentle hands, about all of it. She knew I'd find you. She planned it. The secret message, the promise to deliver it in person. She was matchmaking from her deathbed. That's the most Aisling thing she ever did." Inara smiled. She took the notebook and wrote one final line, the last words she would write to him, because after today the notebook would no longer be necessary. He was learning her language, and soon his hands would speak as fluently as hers, and the bridge between them would be built entirely from the movement of fingers in air. "The most beautiful and the most human form of communication that exists," she wrote. "Come to the garden on Sunday. Bring the ashes. It's time to plant her where she wanted to grow." Kael read the words. He looked at Inara. He looked at the stained glass window where St. Catherine stood in blue and gold, bathed in the afternoon light that Aisling had said made the chapel feel like the inside of a painting. And he understood that this was not an ending, but a transition, not the closing of the door behind which Aisling lived in memory, but the opening of a door into a room where grief and love could coexist, where the past and the present could occupy the same space without one destroying the other, where a dead woman's last wish could be fulfilled by the hands of a living woman who had carried those wishes from silence into language and from language into life. "Sunday," he said. "I'll be there." Inara signed. "I know. You never leave anything unfinished." They sat together as the afternoon light moved through the stained glass, and the candle burned in its red glass holder, and Brother Tomas, passing the chapel door, glanced in and saw them. The large auburn-haired man and the tall, dark-skinned woman sitting hand in hand in the colored light. And he crossed himself and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the particular mystery of human connection, that a dying woman's last words, carried in the hands of a mute interpreter and delivered in a chapel built for prayer, it had become the seed from which something new and living was beginning to grow. He continued down the corridor with a smile that was 40 years in the making, the smile of a man who had served in the space between the living and the dead for long enough to know that the boundary between them is not a wall, but a membrane, and that love passes through it in both directions, from the living to the dead, and from the dead to the living, carried by hands that are gentle enough to hold it without breaking it. Thank you for staying with Inara and Kael through every signed word of this story. Thank you for understanding that silence is not emptiness, that the hands that translate are as powerful as the hands that hold, and that love can begin in the most unexpected places. A hospital room, a funeral, or as a chapel where a mute woman prays for the souls of patients whose last words she carried. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who listens deeply, who communicates without words, who knows that the most important messages are the ones that don't need a voice. Drop a comment telling me, what words would you want carried in someone's hands? I read every single one. Until next time, remember, the loudest love is sometimes the quietest. Listen with your eyes. The hands will tell you everything.